Hello everyone, my name's JoshJrumJrastick and welcome to another episode, or video, of MrBallen. Today's video is top 3 unidentified life forms living in abandoned buildings. Sounds pretty interesting. Today's video is 25 minutes long. Make sure you have your water with you. Water's very important. Anyways, guys, as always, if you enjoy this kind of content, consider leaving a like on the video. It would be very much appreciated. And if you're new here, hi, I'm Josh, and this is what I do. I react to videos, and sometimes I play video games. So if you enjoy that kind of content, consider subscribing and sharing my videos with friends so they may grow and we can all watch and play some awesome videos and video games together. And if you have any suggestions of any videos you'd like me to watch, go down in my comments below, leave me the link or title to the video, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Anyways, on with the video. Bada boop.
As children, we are taught that there is no such thing as monsters, but the people in today's stories would beg to differ. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sell the like button and tell them to give it lots of sunlight, bathe it frequently, and most importantly, feed it after midnight. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's stories.
Let's go! Go away!
In 2017, an electrician named Pete had become accustomed to doing work in basements and sub-basements of older buildings in Baltimore, Maryland. He discovered that many times when he worked in a stretch of older buildings right next to each other, that in the basement or sub-basement, there would be a stretch of tunnel that connected each building to each other, kind of like a common door in a hotel room. One day, Pete was asked to install some new lights in the sub-basements of 3 very old buildings that were all right next to each other. Apparently, someone had purchased the entire building complex after they had sat there abandoned for some time. When Pete arrived, his foreman, whose name was Mike, was waiting for him outside the farthest east building. And so Pete got out, walked up to the building, and Mike led him down to the basement and then down another flight of stairs into the sub-basement. The first thing Pete did was pull his flashlight out and look around and see if there was a tunnel connecting to the adjoining buildings, because if there was, it would make his life a lot easier. And sure enough, he shined his light to the west and there was a tunnel. And so he knew he wouldn't need to lug his gear up and over after he was done with each building. After that, Pete and Mike set up floodlights inside of that first sub-basement they were going to be working in, and then they put their gear on and they got to work. After a few hours of Pete being really focused on what he was working on, he looked up and realized Mike was gone, and he assumed he must have gone upstairs for a lunch break, and Pete, who had had a really big breakfast, wasn't that hungry, but wanted to take a break, so he decided instead of eating, he would just go explore the other sub-basements. So Pete walked over to that first tunnel that went into the second building. He walked through it. It wasn't very far, maybe 5 or 6 feet to get into the next building. Once he got into that second building, it was totally dark because neither he nor Mike had actually gotten in there yet. And so Pete pulled his flashlight out and he scanned around the room, and he saw directly on the other side, still going west across the building complex, was yet another tunnel connected to the third and final building. And so Pete walked through the second sub-basement, shining around, looking for anything interesting. There was nothing down there. He got to that tunnel, he walked through, and he entered into the third and final room of the entire building complex. And so he lifted his flashlight up and he scanned around the room, and he was shocked when on the other side, still going west as if there was a fourth building, there was another tunnel. Pete kept his flashlight trained on this tunnel, and he's thinking to himself, did I get something wrong here? Is there really 4 buildings? Because I'm almost positive there was 3. There shouldn't be a tunnel over there because there's no more buildings. And so he's really intrigued, and so he keeps his flashlight up and he starts walking across the room towards this tunnel, and he gets about halfway across this sub-basement when he hears someone's voice come out of this mysterious tunnel, and it sounds an awful lot like Mike's. And Pete would say that his initial reaction to this was, oh, I guess Mike must have had his lunch break and then come back down here and started doing the same thing I'm doing, exploring the other sub-basements. And so he's already checked out this tunnel and he wants to show me what's down there. So Pete walks over to this tunnel and he shines his light inside, and right away he can tell it's different than the other 2 tunnels he's walked through, because those went straight across, and this tunnel he's looking at goes down and kind of bends off to the right. And so, totally unconcerned, because he believes Mike is down there already, he starts walking down this winding tunnel. After walking for a couple of minutes just straight down into this tunnel, he finally walks into this huge room with 20-foot-high ceilings, and he lifts his flashlight up and he looks around and there's no Mike, and he yells out for him. He doesn't hear him, but he noticed in the middle of the room were all these small animal skeletons that had been arranged in a big triangle on the ground. And as he scanned across the ground with his light, he came to the right side of the room at one of the points of the triangle. And at the top of that point was this large dog-like skeleton lying on the ground. It looked as if the triangle was more like an arrow, and it was pointed at this one large dog. Pete went back to looking around the room, and he saw right across from him was another tunnel entrance into more unexplored passageway. And for a second, he thought about just turning around and leaving, because this whole thing was starting to give him the creeps. But then he heard what sounded like Mike's voice again calling from that unexplored tunnel. And so he decided, okay, I'll walk a little bit farther to see what Mike wants. And so Pete carefully walked across this room, being careful not to step on any of the bones.
Mike.
And right before he walked into this new tunnel, he pulled his phone out in case he might have service and he could just call Mike and see what he wanted. But he had no service on his phone, so he entered the new tunnel. Unlike the other tunnel that went down the whole time, this new tunnel was totally flat, but it was a little bit more narrow. And so as he's walking, it's kind of zigging and zagging, and it's just getting a little bit tight on his shoulders as he's moving. And after a couple of minutes of walking and yelling out for Mike and not hearing from him, he just stops and he just thinks, is this a good idea? Should I keep walking down this strange tunnel, or should I just go back and meet Mike back up in the sub-basement? And as he's standing there facing away from the direction he just came, he thinks he hears something behind him. So Pete turns around and shines his light, and there's no one there. He yells out for Mike, and Mike doesn't yell back. And then Pete hears the faint clicking sound of something moving on all fours in the chamber he had just come from.
Dog.
And he's thinking to himself, what could have gotten down here? There's only one way in, and I've taken the other tunnel. Did I miss some dog that was staying in the middle there? I think I would have seen an animal that was moving around. And so as he's thinking about this, he realizes the clicking sounds have stopped. It's gone completely silent. And so he stops and he's just intently listening. And then all of a sudden, whatever it is out there starts running at full speed down the tunnel towards Pete. And so Pete immediately turns around and starts sprinting down this unexplored tunnel. All he hears behind him is this animal at full sprint, grunting and bouncing into walls as it gains on him. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, Pete gets to the end of this tunnel and he sees it's a small flight of stairs to a large metal door. He runs up and he grabs the door and he tries to open it, and it opens. He runs outside, pulls it shut, hears it click, and then he sinks down with his back against the door, pressing up against it to ensure it stays shut. And as Pete is sitting there, he hears this thing come barreling into the room where this door is, and it rams into the door, and he feels it shake the door forward, but the door holds. And then whatever it was just lost interest, turned around, and left. Even though this animal appeared to be gone and the door appeared to hold, Pete stayed sitting with his back up against the door for a couple of minutes while he composed himself. He really didn't know what to make of what just happened, because he's thinking to himself, that animal had to have been huge. It just nearly barreled this door down. I felt the whole door shake. I mean, if that's a dog, that is a huge dog. And also, where's Mike? Mike's the whole reason I went into this tunnel in the first place. He was calling to me, or so I thought he was, and I never saw him. And so Pete's totally confused, and he's traumatized, and he's looking around, and he's finally taking stock of where he is, and he realizes he's under one of the docks of what would turn out to be the Four Seasons Hotel, which meant he was at least about a half-mile away from where he had started in the sub-basement of those buildings. Pete stood up and made his way up to the sidewalk where he called Mike. And Mike was very confused at what Pete was telling him, because he said, I never went into that tunnel. I never went into the other sub-basements. At my lunch break, I just went upstairs and got a bite to eat, and when I came down, you were gone. And so Pete started talking about the animal he saw, and as he was describing it, he's thinking to himself how crazy he must sound, and he began to realize that it had to be, a stray dog got in there, and he just must not have seen it, and that was it. And so after they hang up, Pete is left thinking to himself, if that was a stray dog, then what were those bones arranged in that triangle for, and why did they seem to be an arrow pointing at that other bigger dog, and also, who was yelling to me inside of the tunnel if it wasn't Mike? But when Pete and Mike got back to those old buildings, they did not do any more exploration. It was like they were just not going to talk about what happened. Instead, they put a fold-up table in front of that tunnel that led down to the room filled with bones and whatever animal was down there, and they rushed the job in all the sub-basements, got all the lights up as fast as they could. The last thing they did was they moved the table back out of the way and then ran up out of the building and never looked back.
We got in the car.
Sounds like something I would do, yeah.
and we were driving down PCH, and I said, "Are you branded?"
I don't know what that means, but I don't care.
There is a large abandoned factory on the outskirts of Cleveland, Ohio that used to be a prominent rubber company, but in the late 1970s, when they closed down business, nobody else leased the factory space, and so for decades it remained untouched. In the 1980s, a boy named Kurt was born in Cleveland, and from a young age, he was fascinated by this abandoned factory. He really wanted to see what was inside, but his dad would never take him, saying it was way too dangerous to go in there. And so over the years, Kurt still wanted to see what was inside, but his fascination with it kind of waned because he was never allowed to go. Then, in the late 1990s, when Kurt was in high school, he happened to be walking by the factory after leaving a friend's house, and he stopped, and he looked at his watch, and it was 8 p.m. He didn't have to be home for about an hour and a half, and he looked up at the crumbling brick building, and he thought to himself, you know what? It's now or never. I have to see what's inside of there. And so he walks right up to the factory. There's no fences around it to stop him, and he gets up there, and he sees that all the doors are sealed shut, and so he's a little bit disheartened, and he starts walking around the property, and when he gets to the backside, he sees on one of the corners of the building, the concrete has just fallen off, exposing a fairly large hole in the side of the building that he could just walk right through. And so he slipped through, and he looked inside this building that he's been thinking about for years and years and years, and he would say it was just so cool. There were all these boats that had just been left in storage inside of this factory and then were apparently forgotten about. There were all these conveyor belts and big pieces of factory equipment that had just been kind of left out on the floor, and no one thought to break them down or even try to sell them. And then, like any other good abandoned building, there was lots of drug paraphernalia scattered all over the ground. And so for the next hour, Kurt just explored the first floor and made his way up to the second floor where the manager's office was. And all in all, it was just a really awesome experience, many years in the making. And at some point, he looked at his watch and it was getting late, and he realized he needed to leave. And so as he was getting ready to leave, he could have sworn he heard the sound of music being played from somewhere in the factory. And so he stopped and he turned around and he just listened for a second to see if he really was hearing music, and he was. It was someone playing the blues somewhere in the factory. Because Kurt had obsessed over this factory for so many years, wondering what was inside, now that there was some mystery about what was in here, he couldn't just leave. He had to go look and see where that music was coming from. And so Kurt began walking across the factory floor in the direction where he thought this music was coming from, and he reached a wall that was covered by a big blue tarp, and that's where it seemed to be coming from, like it was coming from the other side of the wall. And so he went up to put his ear against this wall, and when he did, he almost fell into the tarp, because behind the tarp was actually a stairwell that led down into the basement. And so again, because Kurt was so fascinated by this place, he had to see what was down there. And so he grabs the tarp, and he pulls it aside, and he starts looking downstairs, and he can tell there's a light on down there. And so he's telling himself, okay, it's possible someone could be down there. But again, he's gonna go down, he's gonna have a look. He pulls the tarp,
gonna go down,
aside,
you're gonna get hit by a druggie.
And he begins walking down. And
sounds
from his
really
perspective,
smart,
he would not be able to see any of the basement until he got all the way to the bottom. There was no gaps in the railing. It was basically solid wall all the way down. And when he got to the bottom, he could only turn left. Turning right was just a dead end. Left was towards the main section of the basement. And so he goes all the way down the steps. His heart is racing because he's half expecting to see someone come running up to him. And right before he breaks the corner, when he can actually see into the basement, he takes a deep breath, and then very slowly he kind of pokes his head around the corner and gets a look inside the basement. It's a very odd scene in there, but there doesn't appear to be any people. And so Kurt took the last couple of steps down to the bottom, he turned the corner and actually got a full look at the basement. And sitting in the middle of the room is a cassette player with the play button pressed down that's playing the music. So he's found the origin of the music. And then he starts looking around and realizes on all of the walls are pieces of paper, hundreds of them, that have all been plastered to the walls that all say the exact same 3 words. She gotta run. They're everywhere. Then he looks in the back corner and he sees there is this large wooden animal sculpture, although he can't tell what kind of animal it is, but clearly someone has been hacking at it with a hammer or a saw or maybe both, and it's been burned. It looks like someone's been taking a lot of frustration out on it. And then in the other corner, away from this animal sculpture, was this chair that appeared to have been removed from a school desk. and it was angled towards the corner of the room. And then behind it on the ground was this massive stack of VHS tapes, and each of them had a woman's name on it. And Kurt, from a distance, could only make out one name, which was Jessica, but he could clearly see there was a bunch of other tapes with different names on them. Kurt suddenly was not feeling brave anymore and wanted to get out of there immediately, because at this point, he's pretty certain that whoever's down here is not a good person. They got some bad stuff going on down here. And so he turns around and he starts walking up the stairs. He makes his way across the factory floor, and he finally gets to the crack in the cement, and he makes his way out, and he's out to safety again. Even though Kurt was really excited about having finally explored the factory, on his walk home, it dawned on him that while he was there, someone had to have manually pressed the play button on that tape recorder that was playing the music, because it wasn't playing when he got there. So either he miraculously avoided ever making contact with this person or group of people inside of this factory while he explored it for over an hour, or the more likely scenario is as soon as Kurt walked inside, this person or group of people knew he was there and were watching him the whole time. And maybe when they hit play on that cassette player and started playing that music, that was just an attempt to lure Kurt down into the basement. Who knows what would have happened if he had stayed even longer? And who knows what's on those VHS tapes? To this day, Kurt and all of his friends are convinced he was in the presence of a serial killer.
Agreed.
In 2013, three 12-year-olds named Paul, Tim, and Max were living in New Orleans. And even though they were too young to remember Hurricane Katrina from 2005, the devastation it left in its wake was around them every day. Just down the street from their neighborhood was a row of houses that had all been abandoned after they were destroyed by the storm surge. And Paul, who was the ringleader of the group, would routinely drag Tim and Max into that row of houses to look for treasure, but they rarely left with anything more than some old clothes and some broken kitchenware. One day, Paul told Tim and Max that if they wanted to find some real treasure, they would have to go looking inside of the abandoned hospital. Despite it being completely boarded up, windows, doors, and a huge fence around it, Paul said he had discovered an entrance in the back of the building. Tim and Max were not nearly as excited as Paul about this idea, because all they had heard about this hospital was criminals lived inside of it. They had also heard that the basement was completely flooded and basically the whole structure was not safe. But Paul was really convincing because he told them they were being babies. And so they said, okay, well, we'll go with you then. So the boys drove their bikes the couple of miles over to where this hospital was, and they eventually reached the big chain link fence that surrounded the entire property with no trespassing signs all over it. Behind the fence, they saw this ominous entrance into this underground parking garage that even from the street level, you could look down and clearly see it was totally flooded with gross, stagnant, dark water. But the boys carried on, and Paul led them to a section of the chain link fence that had been cut open. So the boys parked their bikes and locked them up, and then crawled through the gap in the fence and began walking up the small parking lot that led up to the loading dock of the hospital. As they got closer, Paul pointed to a shed that was situated right underneath a broken out window on the second floor, and it was immediately clear that people were using the shed to climb up and through that window. Paul was the first one to climb onto the shed, and then from there he jumped up and grabbed the ledge of the broken window and hoisted himself up and then very carefully climbed through. Once he got through, he turned around and yelled for the boys to come up. Once all three of them got inside and they began looking around, they were amazed at what they saw. There was all this medical equipment that had just been left out. Clearly there had not been an attempt at salvaging anything inside of this hospital. There were even blood samples still sitting out on tables. That day, the boys explored the entire floor they came in on, which was the second floor, and by the end of the day, they left with a couple of random medical souvenirs. Over the following few months, the boys kept coming back to the hospital and had eventually explored every room on every floor except for one. The basement. They wanted to go down there, but even Paul thought it was a bad idea because it was completely flooded with disgusting standing water, and there were no windows that went down into the basement, so it was totally pitch black. But by the end of the summer, they were getting bored with all the other floors of the hospital. They had seen everything, they had found everything, there was nothing left to explore. And so they decided, we're going to go in the basement. So one afternoon, they put on some dirty old clothes that they didn't mind ruining, and they made their way over to the hospital. They parked their bikes, they snuck through the fence, they made their way up to the shed, they climbed up into the second floor, they walked down the second floor hallway down to the flight of stairs, they went down to the first floor where the stairs stopped. From there, they walked over to an access door that led to another flight of stairs that just went down into the basement. And so they open that door up, they step inside, and they get their flashlights out because it's pitch black inside of the stairwell. stairwell, and they shined their lights down the steps, and it was a half flight of stairs that led to a dry landing, and then there was another flight of stairs from the landing going down to the basement floor, and the final steps of that second set of stairs were completely submerged. So with their flashlights up, they walk down the first flight of stairs to the landing, they turn around and they stop and they shine their light into the basement. And what they see is just deep, dark, murky, standing water. And from their perspective, the basement was not some huge, sprawling, open space like you would imagine. Instead, they were looking down at a wall because there was this hallway that ran perpendicular to the stairs. And so it went all the way to the right and all the way to the left, but they couldn't see down either of them. They could only see basically the landing of the stairs. In order to look down the hall, they would need to go into the water and walk a few feet into the hall. And so as the boys are just scanning their flashlights into this murky water inside of this small segment of the basement that they could see, Paul finally says, "All right, you know what? Screw it, I'm going." And he slowly walks down that final flight of stairs and he takes his first step into the water. And Tim and Max, they stay up on the landing. They're going to let Paul go on his own first.
Yeah, Paul
takes another step. And another step, and before long, he says he's reached the basement floor and he's up to his chest in this disgusting water. And so he's keeping his arms high up out of the water, he's still got his flashlight, and he wades out to the point where he can actually look down the hallway in either direction. And so he looks down one way, and then he looks down the other way, and then he turns around to face Tim and Max, who are still back up on the landing, and he says, "You can't see down either hallway. There's huge filing cabinets, and there's a generator down there, and I can't see in either direction. We probably can't go very far." At this point, Tim and Max feel compelled to go down there with their friend, and so they walk down that final flight of stairs into the water, and they wade their way over next to Paul, at which point they shine their lights down the hall. And sure enough, they basically can't see anything past maybe 5 or 6 meters down each hallway. As the boys were standing in the middle of the hallway, not making any moves in either direction, they suddenly hear something down the far right side of the hallway. And they shine their lights and they realize their view's completely obstructed, and whatever's made this sound, they can't see it. It's blocked by the generator and the filing cabinet. And as they're shining their lights, they still can't see anything. They hear a massive splash, like someone cannonballed at the far end of the hallway. And the boys do not stick around to try to get a better angle to see it. They immediately turn around and run as fast as they can, or as fast as the water will allow them, back to the steps, back to the landing, back to the first floor, back to the second floor, down the hall, out the window, and they run all the way back to their bikes. And by the time they're back there, they're panting, they're soaking wet, they haven't spoken yet. It was like intuitive fight or flight, and they were out of there, and they're sitting there heaving, and they look at each other and they start laughing. It was like this adrenaline rush. It was crazy what they were doing. And they look back up at the hospital and they're staring at the second floor window, almost half expecting to see whoever it was that made this big splashing sound to suddenly emerge in the window, but no one ever did. And after about an hour of just staring at the hospital and seeing no activity whatsoever, they convinced themselves that whatever they heard down in that hallway was probably just something falling off a shelf, or maybe there's a bird down there, but whatever it was harmless. Eventually, Paul says to Tim and Max that they should totally go back in there and try to figure out what it was that made that sound. And initially, Tim and Max are like, I don't really want to do that. But eventually, after Paul called them babies enough times, they said, okay, fine, we'll go back in the hospital.
I'll be a baby.
Walk up
I'm
the
good.
Parking lot. They climb onto the second floor.
I'll be classified as a baby.
Down the hall. They go down the stairs.
I
they
feel
get to
like
that
living.
access door that leads down into the basement. And before they just fling it open, Paul gets his flashlight up. He turns the handle and he opens the door just a little bit and looks inside to see if anybody's in there. And there isn't, so he opens the door the rest of the way, and he, Tim, and Max go inside. Once they're inside, they shine their light down to the landing, and they can still see their wet footprints all over the steps. It's silence inside of the basement. They make their way down to the landing. They turn around, they shine the light into the water in the basement itself, and now the water is completely calm again. There's no motion. It's still completely quiet. And as they're standing there looking, it's clear all of them are hesitating. They don't want to go back into chest-deep, murky, stagnant water, and they also don't know what it was that made that sound. While they were outside, they're really confident it wasn't a big deal, but now that they're in this dark basement, it seemed a little bit more intimidating. And so Tim suggests they throw something into the water to try to get a reaction from whatever this thing is, if it's alive. But they didn't have anything to throw, and then Paul, out of nowhere, takes his flashlight and throws it into the water. And before Tim or Max could react to what he just did, they all just stopped and listened to see if that would cause a reaction from whatever it was down there. And as the flashlight sunk to the bottom and completely out of view because the water was so murky, There was no reaction down there. It was still completely silent. Paul turns to Tim and Max and says, the reason I threw it is now we have to go in because I have to get my flashlight. So Paul, along with Tim and Max, make their way down that final flight of stairs. They start walking into the water. They get all the way up to their chest in water, and they wade out until Paul is directly over the light. He can barely see it through the murky water, but he can clearly see it below him. And since he doesn't want to go under the water, he tried to use his feet to get the light up, but he couldn't do it. And so he looks at Tim and Max and he goes, I'm going under. He takes a deep breath and he goes under the water. He immediately hears the muffled screams of Tim and Max up on the surface. And as he's fumbling for his light, he feels one of them yank on his shirt to try to pull him up and out of the water. Paul manages to grab his flashlight. He comes out of the water and he turns and he sees Tim and Max booking it for the stairs. And before he can even turn around and run after them, he realizes why they're running in the first place. To his right, he can hear the sound of something huge swimming up the hallway towards him. For a brief second, he raises his flashlight and shines it down the hall. And right at the filing cabinet, this dark silhouette that's in the water, that's lying horizontal in the water, is violently swimming up the hall towards him so fast there is a wake of water coming off of it. Paul turns and runs towards the stairs, or as fast as he can go. He's trying to wade through this water that's chest deep on him. He gets to the stairs. He runs up to the landing. He can see his friends are up at the door leading out of the basement stairwell, and they're yelling for him to hurry up, hurry up. They got the door open. Paul turns the corner and runs up to that door, and right as he's leaving, he can hear whatever it was that was swimming down the hall has stopped and is now on the stairs. He goes to the access door, and he and his buddies run upstairs to the second floor. They run down the hallway. They get into that room. They leap out the window, onto the shed, onto the ground, and they run all the way out to the break in the fence where they hop on their bikes and they bike away. And as they're leaving, they turn around to look, and there's no one. There's no one in the window. There's no one outside on the property. Whoever or whatever was chasing them is still in the hospital. The boys believe it was an alligator living in the basement of this hospital, but they never found out for sure.
No,
While
it's
they
a gator.
continued to urban explore around New Orleans, they never went back to that hospital.
That is
so that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already,
that's why they didn't. That's why I didn't chase him up the stairs. Because it's a gator. It's a gator. Anyways, guys, as always, I hope you enjoyed this. Tell me down below what you think the thing was. I think it's a gator. That's why I didn't chase him up the stairs. It must have found an access way through something. Or it must have found its way to water down there. But it doesn't make sense because it can't really live off of food. There's no food down there. So give it a couple years, that thing will die. And then you can just drain out the basement, I guess. Figure out what it was. It's probably a gator. Some kind of amphibious something. Most likely a gator. Yeah, I think it's a gator. That's what I'm going to say. Anyways, guys, as always, stay strong, everyone. Stay safe. Wear your seatbelt, wear your helmet, wear your mask. Don't put the flashlight behind you. Don't look in the haunted mirrors. And as always, have a nice day. Oh, yeah. It was a gator.